Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Matthew Petrusik, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute and the new host of the Word on Fire show. Thank you for joining us. Higher education in crisis. According to Fortune magazine, overall undergraduate enrollment has dropped over 8% from 2019 to 2022, which is the steepest rate in decline on record. And the picture has only worsened since then. There are several explanations for these plummeting numbers, including the residual effects of the pandemic, ballooning costs, student debt, and the demographic decline. Fewer children being born eventually means fewer college students. However, another cause is entirely self-imposed. Most universities and colleges have now replaced education with ideology, subverting the search for truth with political indoctrination. Today, to discuss this ideological takeover of higher education and how the Catholic conception of the university can help provide an antidote, is Bishop Robert Barron. Well, Bishop, before we begin, how does it feel to be in the Word on Fire studios in your own diocese doing this?
It's good. You know, Brandon proposed this show a long time ago. And what I had in mind was this, that we'd have two people, together. And then I was sent to California as a bishop. He was in Orlando. And so it just developed as the two of us as kind of talking heads side by side. But my original idea was just this. So I'm happy, yes, to be in the same room with you.
I'm delighted to be in the same room with you. So we're talking today about whether there's a Catholic antidote to the crisis in higher education. So let's start by referring to an article that you recently wrote entitled Ivy League Presidents and the Collapse of Moral Reasoning. The article was prompted by the shocking refusal of the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and UPenn to condemn anti-Semitism on their campuses. But you brought out some really important underlying themes as well, including the embrace of moral relativism, the dismissal of the existence of intrinsically evil acts, and this simplistic dividing of the world into oppressor versus oppressed. And you end the article by giving some brief arguments on how the Catholic social thought tradition can be an antidote to that. So can you expand on that a little bit before we get into some more particular questions?
Well, I'll say something about the intrinsically evil category, because I think it's exceptionally important. When that's bracketed, and it is across the board in many cases today, when that's bracketed, you invite moral chaos. And it might sound like you're just being very friendly and you're being very open to a variety of perspectives. But when you say there aren't certain things that are just wrong, period, no matter what your intention is, no matter what the circumstances are, no matter what might come because of it, they're just wrong in themselves. When you bracket that category, moral chaos follows. And the very fact, what I noticed was those three presidents unable to say, calling for the genocide of Jews, well, it depends on the context. Well, that's a classically sort of relativistic way to get at the problem. If you can't summon the courage to say, calling for genocide is intrinsically wrong, well, then there's something very off in your moral thinking. To me, Catholic social teaching, if you want to get to the very bottom of it, relies upon these truly objective moral values and, you might say, a cognizance of deep moral disvalue. It's very clear on value and on intrinsic evil. When that foundation's lost, chaos follows.
So this is a very particular problem that's happening throughout, especially secular universities. But to sort of frame the whole conversation we're going to be having, could you give us a sense of what, at the definitional or conceptual level, would fundamentally distinguish a Catholic university, the ideal form of a Catholic university, from its secular counterpart?
Well, a Catholic university is one that takes Jesus Christ as central. If you say Jesus Christ is the Logos made flesh, then necessarily he's at the center of all the logoi, all the particular expressions of Logos that you'd find in physics and chemistry and history and English and everything else. So a Catholic university will anchor the entire academic enterprise in him. If you want to find the fundamental value, that's it. Then clustering around that fundamental value are other values that we can name. But I'd say that's the main difference, is the centrality of the Logos, and more precisely, the Logos made flesh.
There's been a revival within some secular circles to recreate Catholic higher education. One of them is the University of Austin, for example, that's recently been founded. And the way they frame it is that the university exists for the search for truth. And I think in a broad sense, the Catholic position would agree with that. However, there's a potential tension there that I'd like you to speak to. So if we say that the university exists for the search for truth, but then we also say, in light of how you just explained, that Christ is at the center in the form of the Logos, that we already sort of have the fullness of truth, especially understood as embodied in the Catholic Church. How do we hold those two tensions together?
Well, my first challenge would be to anyone who would contest that claim. Find the truth that you're assuming as you begin your academic enterprise. There's no such thing as a purely neutral epistemological space. You can't search for the truth unless you're, in some sense, standing on some truth that you assume. Now, that's the case in the sciences. That's the case in psychology. The case in literature. There's always some fundamental assumption. So, in a way, it's this sort of red herring that people will pull out to say, "Oh, well, you Catholics, you're not taking the search for truth seriously." Everybody has some fundamental presupposition. Having said that, well, now off you go. I mean, if you say Jesus Christ is the Logos made flesh, well, then I'm confident that all the logoi that I seek will be in relation to him, and that if I find them, I'm indirectly finding him. And so there's no limit. Off you go in the sciences, off you go in psychology, off you go in history. Look for all the truth you want. If it's true, it won't lead you away from Christ. And so it's a false problem. And I would just urge people to kind of run around their own assumptions. There is no neutral epistemological space. Everyone's standing on something foundational when you begin the intellectual quest.
Is it fair to say that it's not only the case that sort of accidentally it happens to be true that everybody has a sort of a presupposition, but isn't that presupposition necessary even to search for truth?
Yeah. No, quite right. Quite right. You can't jump unless you're on some kind of foundation. And so the sort of romanticism of the quest, as though it's all about the quest, it's always a play between searching and finding, being found, searching more, fundamental versus secondary, starting from home base, moving into the unknown. There's always that dynamic in any intellectual enterprise.
So let's move from the more theoretical to the more practical. So as you know, schools like Harvard, UPenn, MIT are secular schools. And as you've discussed many times before, there's this ideological takeover happening of these institutions in real time. Do you see the Catholic conception of the university and the Catholic reality of the university in any way able to resist this ideological takeover precisely because of its Catholic identity?
Yeah, absolutely, because it's grounded in these values, both moral and epistemic, that keep it from this complete relativism. Because one of the marks of wokeism, which I've been a kind of ardent critic of, is a relativism at the intellectual level, is a kind of indifferentism. Truth is often just a mask for power relationships. So that goes back to Nietzsche, comes up through the critical theorists of the 20th century, that idea that, when you're claiming something to be true, you're actually just playing a power game. You're trying to use your truth claim to dominate others. The Catholic tradition does not hold to that Nietzschean trajectory going up through critical theory. It holds to the legitimacy of the search for truth, the possibility of finding truth, and that provides a certain bulwark against this relativism and the reduction of truth to power relationships. That's something I find deeply troubling in the wokist mentality. Because wokeism, as I've said, is kind of a popularization of critical theory. And the critical theory flourishing, let's say, mid-20th century in both the German and French academies. But coming into our country, let's say in the 70s, 80s, I would say gestating there as a kind of bacillus and then spilling out into the culture just in very recent years. That's what you see in wokeism. I would hope the Catholic universities are a real bulwark against that problem.
Let's speak to some of the challenges that Catholic universities are facing in the contemporary cultural climate and political climate. So St. John Paul II famously wrote in Ex Cordia Ecclesia, in his document of how to understand the nature of the Catholic university and how to at a high level how to implement it, how to administer it, that Catholic universities must not only hire faithful Catholic faculty, but have them at least 50%. Is that a realistic standard now?
Yeah, I agree with it because it's a way of concretizing the idea. We can speak very abstractly about this problem and say, there should be a Catholic character to the faculty. Well, that's a way of instantiating it. And I know, we can quarrel with it, 51% versus 47% or whatever. But I think as a goal, majority Catholic faculty, administrators, people with an ardent Catholic sensibility, or at the very least, people that aren't inimical to the Catholic tradition. They're not opposed to it. So besides the 51%, I want other members of the faculty at least to be supportive of a Catholic program. Things get really dicey, and as you know, this is not just a theoretical musing. Things get dicey when you got people at Catholic universities who are antipathetic toward Catholic epistemic and moral values. That's a major problem. Because to me, then what's the point? At that point, to me, close the place down. If you've got faculty administrators who are militating against the Catholic view of life, at the very least, someone should do no evil. Someone should at least vaguely support the program. But if you got people who are actively against it, then you got a real serious problem.
Right. So some Catholic institutions appear to have taken, it hasn't been their overt approach, it's been their approach in practice to say, well, the way we're going to maintain our identity is we're going to segregate our identity to the theology department.
I know, right.
Is that a hopeful solution?
No, it's not. And it's repugnant to a Catholic imagination. As I was laying out earlier, if Christ is the Logos, you can't segregate him. And you can't say, he just belongs to theology. No, if he's the Logos made flesh, any Logos is related to him. So I gave an address, what was this, last year, this time at Notre Dame, and I tried to make that argument, to show in mathematics, to show in the sciences, to show in literature, how if pushed all the way to the bottom, you're going to find a relationship to God, to the Logos. And so I might say it's a modern temptation. It's the modern prejudice to say, sure, religion's fine as long as you privatize it. Christianity can't be a privatized religion. Jesus is crucified publicly, He's proclaimed as risen publicly. It's what got the first Christians in such trouble. If we privatize the faith, then we undermine the evangelical project. A Catholic university, like any Catholic institution, has as its primary purpose evangelization. If it doesn't, it should close. So the privatization or segregation of Christ simply to the theology faculty is repugnant to a Catholic sensibility.
What role do you see the theology faculty or the Department of Theology playing in a Catholic university in its ideal form?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we wrestle with that. I think it would be great if the theologians at a Catholic university could help the other professors see these relationships. If you put it up as a kind of rose window with theology in the center and then connected by spokes to all the other elements, good. Could the theologians help the mathematicians to see their relationship to Christ, the physicists to see it, the literature specialists, and therefore to see what connects them to each other, right? Because the elements of the rose window are connected to the center, and by that very fact, to each other. I wonder, even at Catholic universities, how often that conversation is even had. Do the mathematicians and physicists and literature specialists and historians talk to each other about what links their disciplines together? I think that might be a great role for the theologians, or maybe the Catholic philosophers on a faculty.
Another challenge that applies to all universities, but especially Catholic universities in the context of our conversation, is the question of academic freedom.
Yeah.
So I think a justifiable critique of this ideological takeover of all universities has been that it's squashing academic freedom and replacing it with political indoctrination. But the same critics making that point could say, well, look, Catholic universities can't really have academic freedom, can they? Because they're committed to this vision of reality and ultimately to the authority of the church. So how do we balance academic freedom in a Catholic university?
We have to go right back to what we were saying a few minutes earlier. There's no such thing as a pure absolute academic freedom. That's a fantasy. Because everyone, as we said, has undergirding assumptions. Everyone has some at least implicit sense of where the intellectual enterprise is supposed to go. Now, within that framework of foundational values and aspirational goals, There is room, of course, for freedom of research and publication and so on. But it's a fantasy to say that something like absolute freedom ever obtains. Within a Catholic framework, I don't advocate for some kind of absolute academic freedom. I would say, no, we operate within the framework provided by Christ and for the purpose of evangelization, ultimately. Now, within that framework, fine. Again, I would say to the physicist and the chemist and the mathematician, off you go. Search, your subject as freely and fully as you can. But realizing all the time that it's grounded in and oriented to some basically given value. So it's how you construe that. I think it's construed in a simplistic way as just sort of a completely open-ended, directionless, search. No, everyone's search for truth is conditioned by certain values, either implicit or explicit.
This is closely connected to the idea of the freedom of speech as well. So academic freedom typically we associate with faculty, freedom of speech with the students. So what kind of advice can you give to Catholic administrators who might be looking at the landscape and saying, oh no, what happens if on my campus we start getting these calls, for example, for the erasure of the state of Israel?
Right. Again, there's no such thing as this completely untrammeled freedom of speech. We wouldn't accept that in our society. So the famous, I can't shout fire in a crowded theater is the kind of test case. So no, we don't accept that, like an absolute freedom of speech. And if speech becomes morally problematic and speech becomes, like in the case of our Ivy League presidents, I'm calling for genocide. Well, no, I don't think we hold to absolute freedom. Freedom is always a conditioned reality. Or like in the moral framework, Matt, very well that, real moral freedom is not so much freedom from all, constraint, but rather it's a kind of freeing for the attainment of the good. It's a liberation of the soul for the attainment of the good. That's a good framework for thinking about a Catholic university, I think, and the free search for both epistemic and moral goods.
And the training of how to use that freedom.
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
quite right.
another fundamental challenge applying to all universities is the decline of the participation of men. So according to a recent Pew study, only 42% of the student population now is men, and it continues to go downward. So what can the Catholic intellectual tradition and the Catholic university do to stop this hemorrhaging?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a really good answer to that, but that's bothered me too as I watch those stats. And that's been accelerating in the last, about 20, 25 years. Because it wasn't the case, heck, in the course of my lifetime. But in the last 20, 25 years, that's really accelerated. Maybe end all this nonsense about toxic masculinity and that young men especially are made to feel very often that they're a criminal class, and that can happen very early in their education. So let's cut that out and let the boys be boys and to find their own way of expressing themselves and not to characterize them from the time they're little as toxic. I think that's a step we can take. And offering courses, maybe things that appeal more to men. We might get into it a little bit later, but maybe instead of high theoretical courses, but some like vocational courses, practical things that men would find very appealing, and to let that flourish within a university framework.
That's a perfect bridge to my next question, because there is a movement that's counter the woke ideological takeover of the university. It says a pox on all your houses.
Yeah.
Any institution of higher education, secular, religious, is ultimately a waste of money. And what we should do as young people is to go into vocational training, to go into HVAC training, to become an electrician or a plumber. Is there value in the critique they're making of higher education as sort of a waste of time? And is vocational training a good alternative?
Well, yeah, to the second one, I'd say, yeah. Just the other day, I was talking to, there were some servers before one of my masses, older kids like in high school. And I asked them, hey, what are your plans for college? And a couple of them had, ideas. The third one, with great confidence, he wasn't at all, shy about it, just said, no, I don't want to go to college. I want to be a car mechanic, and I'm going to go for some training. And I said, yeah, good for you. And I said, you'll make a lot of money, and you'll always be in need. So I think that's a good development, and I have no quarrel with that.
Can you speak at a more theoretical level of how the Catholic understanding of education broadly can sort of combine the vocational and the higher intellectual pursuit? Do we have to see them as at odds?
Yeah,
or-
we shouldn't, right? It's kind of a body-soul question, the integration of the whole self. And I think let people, follow their natural interests. And maybe we did force too many people into the university. I think like my parents' generation, relatively few went to college in those days. Neither of my parents went to college. My father had a very, successful, productive career. He went into sales and all that. But a lot of people their generation didn't go to college. And you wonder, maybe we overdid it. Maybe we just assumed everybody should go to college. And maybe a lot of people, they'll be much happier and more productive for society in these vocational areas.
So cost is another issue. And historically, the Catholic school system, including Catholic universities, have grounded themselves in being accessible to those who don't have a lot of financial resources. Do you think we've sort of lost that as the church to understand our educational institutions as having that specific charge?
Yeah, I worry about that. A lot of people do. All of our schools, from lower level up to universities, have become massively expensive. There are a lot of reasons for that. Some is the loss of religious who staffed a lot of these institutions. So I do worry about that. And the church should have kind of a wide net that goes out to include a lot of people. They should not become elite institutions for only, the very wealthy. I don't have an easy answer. We've been, as a church, wrestling with that. But that's bothered me. My uncle, was a Christian brother, and the Christian brothers were devoted to educating the poor and kids that maybe wouldn't normally have access to that. And the brothers, in great numbers. And when my uncle was a Christian brother, there were thousands of them around this country dedicated to, educating poorer kids. That was lovely. It's wonderful. So yeah, I do worry about that. We become too elitist.
So we've been identifying some challenges. Let's conclude by identifying some practical steps that the church might be able to take broadly, both laity and clergy, and also speaking specifically to administrators of this school. So what can we do right now to get our Catholic schools back on track, those that have lost their way?
Well, again, yeah, we're presuming some have lost their way. The laity, Vatican II calls for the laity to be involved fully in the life of the church, the universal call to holiness, to take responsibility for the Catholic life at all levels. The laity are the ones ultimately who support institutions financially and send their kids there. Can lay people be very attentive to what's being taught in schools? Can they be attentive to curricula? How many of our lay people look at the curricula of courses their kids are taking? They're the ones who support them, financially and otherwise. So I think that lay people can take responsibility. For the clergy, we shouldn't be on the sidelines. I mean, clergy should be front and center when it comes to Catholic identity, the Catholic purpose of these places. So I think don't just look at it from the outside as a problem that someone else can solve, but that we've all got a stake in it.
Given your sense of where things stand in the culture broadly, is this a time for the creation perhaps of new Catholic institutions, or should we redouble our efforts to strengthen the institutions that are already in place?
Well, there's room for both, I think. And there are some new Catholic institutions that have emerged, and I think, great. It's sort of the Gamaliel principle is, well, let's see what happens. If the Lord is behind them, they'll flourish. If not, they won't. At the same time, to strengthen the institutions that we have and not give up on them. So I think there's room for both, and for creative, entrepreneurial people to think this thing through. Think of the classical schools model, that's taken off in many ways around our country. A lot of devoted Catholic parents who said, I'm unhappy with the way my kids are being formed, both intellectually and morally, in the school systems. So let's try something new. Fine. And then also, but take the existing institutions and do what we can to make them better.
And speaking specifically as the bishop of a diocese, do you have any advice for your brother bishops on their relationship with their own Catholic universities and their dioceses?
Stay connected. One thing I did when I arrived here in Winona, Rochester, is I asked to be placed on the board of St. Mary's University. So the bishop had been on the board there, and then I don't know what happened. For a long time, the bishop wasn't a member of the board. And I asked, and they were very gracious and invited me to join the board. So that's one way a bishop can be very involved in the Catholic university. Look, that's our responsibility. I mean, Catholic identity and purpose of these institutions, that's the bishop's responsibility ultimately. So I say to my brothers, take it seriously.
Well, thank you, Bishop. It's now time for our questionnaire from a listener.
Okay.
We have one from a child, Lucy from Maryland, who has a
Good.
question for
Okay.
you.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Lucy. I'm 8 years old. I live in Maryland. My question is, if priests are supposed to represent Jesus, then do nuns represent Mary?
That's a good question. I would say yes. That's an old tradition that a nun would, in many ways, imitate Mary and walk in the path of Mary. A nun too does represent Jesus the way every Christian's supposed to. So every baptized person is an image of Christ, we would say. So in that way, the priest would do it in a very particular way because he does it within a liturgical, sacramental context. But I'd say to your direct question, yeah, I think religious sisters do take Mary very much as their model.
Well, that's all the time that we have, Bishop. I want to thank you for this inaugural conversation in the Word on Fire studio, and looking forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks, Matt. God bless you.
Thank you. That does it for us today. Thanks for joining us on the Word on Fire show. If you're interested in learning more about how Word on Fire can help you grow closer to Christ and become a better evangelist with and for others, consider joining the Word on Fire Institute. Check us out at institute.wordonfire.org. That's institute.wordonfire.org. See you next time.